Well, welcome to Did Syd Barrett, and in this episode I would like to discuss Did Syd Barrett meddle with Pink Floyd? Or perhaps more accurately, did Syd Barrett meddle by Pink Floyd? And let's go ahead then and kind of call out some of the ideas that I'd like to run through. Now, as I normally do, I kind of want to give a layout for how I want to do this. So first I'm going to run through corrections, then I'm going to break down 3 songs off of the first side of the album, and those will be Pillow of Winds, Fearless, and San Tropez. And then I will discuss Echoes, which is the one song that's on the second side of the album. This album was released in October of '71. It's their 6th album after Atom Heart Mother, and just before they put out Obscured by Clouds. And I don't know if I'm going to discuss Obscured by Clouds. I might, but we'll see. And of course, around this time is when Mr. Barrett was releasing his album Barrett, which I believe was in '70 or '71. So, what exactly do I want to do? Well, first let's do corrections. Our previous episode was about Atom Heart Mother, and I just want to point out that the title itself could be very important. And something I missed, I did mention the initials being AHM, which may be important, I don't know. But it also could just be a very literal thing. An Atom Heart would be a very small-hearted person, or a small-hearted mother, which would be kind of a dig at someone's mother, maybe. Which, well, if you know your history of Mr. Barrett and his writing, then you'll recognize as something that's kind of along the lines of Matilda Mother, with the reproachful lyrics of that song, Why'd You Have to Leave Me There, hanging in my whatever chair, that were part of that very first album, The Piper at the Gates of Dawn. At any rate, this kind of idea of perhaps a reproachful vision of a mother has been explored before by Mr. Barrett, and it appears to possibly be here as well for some reason. I don't know why. Of course, Mr. Barrett and Mr. Waters were raised largely by their mothers because both of their fathers died. So perhaps there's some kind of issue there. I don't know. But let's go ahead then, and we're going to move on to the album itself, Meddle, which most people consider to be a transitionary album from the old Syd Barrett sound to what eventually most people would recognize as Pink Floyd, and that would come in the next few albums with, of course, Dark Side of the Moon. Now, this was, of course, their 6th album, and as we mentioned, Atom Heart Mother was previous, and after this is Obscured by Clouds. And you have to kind of wonder, what was going on from album 1 to album 6 there. And, who's doing the writing, who's putting together what, and why is it taking so long? I guess you could say perhaps they're just kind of refining their style or trying to find their way after Syd Barrett was gone. It's up to you. Now, before we continue, what I would like you to do is go ahead and watch a Roger Waters interview about Syd Barrett, and I will provide a link and I'll give you the information. I would like for you to watch from minutes 17 until minutes 35. And basically what's happening there is from those time frames, Mr. Waters is kind of discussing the work with Mr. Barrett, and also he is discussing kind of how the band was developing, and he's also discussing his memories of what was where and how his writing style kind of developed over time. I want you to pay very, very good attention to it. And what I'll do is I'll suggest that you go ahead and watch it, see what you can see, listen to what he's saying, listen to his memory of events, see if you believe that he's reliable or not, and then if you have any questions about what he's saying, and then we'll come back, and I'm going to note a few things that I've noted in that time frame that I have questions about. I'm not saying I have answers about, but I do have questions about, and we'll see if perhaps you have some of the same questions. So go ahead and check it out and come on back. Okay, so here are my questions, and maybe yours line up somewhat with mine. All right. Now, the first thing that I have questions about is, of course, Mr. Waters says that he wrote a couple of songs on the first album. He did not write a couple of songs. To my knowledge, he wrote one song, and that song was Take Up Thy Stethoscope and Watch. I think he may have been given a secondary credit on another song, but I don't know for sure about that. One of the things I do know is that he mentions Corporal Clegg being the song on that album, and I know that Clegg is not on that album. Clegg is on the Saucer Full of Secrets album. So, there's only so many reasons why someone would have that wrong. One of them is, of course, that perhaps they're losing their memory, or if memory's getting foggy, which happens to everyone with age. Another possible reason is that they just didn't really overly care and remember very well, or perhaps someone else was putting together the albums. You have producers, you have people that are tying together songs. A lot of times musicians are making songs and they're just kind of holding on to them and deciding which one goes on which album. They're not necessarily producing an album in its entirety in a singular setting. So I can see why that would perhaps be a little bit confusing. Okay, the second thing that I would like you to notice is that he specifically mentions that part of his style that developed was on this album in the song Echoes. So from Meddle, he specifically cites the song Echoes, and in particular the third verse of that song, which is about strangers passing in the street. In that bit, he mentions that Syd has a tendency towards literature and citing literature and kind of recycling it, regurgitating it in a new form, and his style is more discussions on relations between people and society and stuff like that. Just keep that in mind. All right. He also mentions during that kind of lead-in that his primary motivation, early on at least, was that he started to kind of notice that a lot of the young guys that were in bands were able to meet really pretty girls. And of course that was his motivation. And then he immediately states he doesn't know what Syd's motivation is, which of course logically makes you wonder, what is he talking about then? The implication is, of course, that perhaps Syd isn't into the music just for meeting cute girls. So what is Syd's motivation? You could take that in different ways, but I will just point out the one thing you do know is that, at least in Roger Waters' mind, that is not the main reason why Mr. Barrett was in music. It was not into the music scene. Either it's because he just really loves the music, or perhaps he's not overly interested in meeting really cute girls, or perhaps he's trying to develop an art form, or something else, or maybe it's a combination of all of them. But very specifically, he makes that connection in his stream of thought behind his conversation, and it is a telling thing to consider. You will also notice that he specifically says in that time frame that it was his idea for Syd to become something like Brian Wilson of the Beach Boys, to be removed from the band and to help them write songs and from the background. And that's because he had become difficult to work with for some reason. And he specifically retells two jokes. One of the jokes that Mr. Barrett did, which is, of course, the pretending to be vacant in the Pat Boone show, and then the Have You Got It Yet kind of legend of him showing up and then changing key constantly on the band so that they couldn't follow him on this song called Have You Got It Yet. And I would just like to point out that a lot of people point to these kinds of things and say, of course, that, oh, he was just crazy or on drugs or whatever. But these are complicated things to do, and they are indicative of creativity and not of mental instability. In my opinion, they are indicative of creativity. So, and perhaps you could even say an incapacity to subject oneself to expectation, or perhaps a rebellious spirit, but not someone who is simply going catatonic because of some kind of issue. This is a person who is choosing to go catatonic at very specific times to a very specific effect. Okay? And I guess that's pretty much it. That's all the things that I kind of have questions about, or points that I wanted to note. I find that Mr. Roger Waters is surprisingly affable in these discussions about Syd. For some reason, I don't know. He retells the story of meeting with Michael Stipe earlier in that interview, and Michael Stipe kind of gives him a little bit of, apparently gives him a little bit of an attitude. I don't know really why. I mean, I get why some people would, but unless, in my opinion, unless you really know something about people, it's very difficult to blame them for things that you believe to be true unless it's been verified. So I get if you have knowledge of very specific things and you want to be mad at Roger Waters, then by all means. But for someone like me, and I suspect for someone like Michael Stipe, it's all just hearsay, and it's very difficult to know exactly what's going on, and the relationships between people can be very complicated. So here's a question for you. What if it was Roger Waters' idea for Mr. Barrett to kind of step back and just be a writer for the band, and they actually came to an agreement to do that? And that was beneficial to both. What if that's what happened? And what if everyone all this time has been blaming Roger Waters for kicking him out of the band? And perhaps quite unfairly, I might add. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of torn on that. I don't know. But the lack of certainty on it on my part leaves it kind of ambiguous enough that I don't really know what's going on, and it's hard to blame someone. Okay. So that's pretty much it. Those are my questions. Perhaps you have other thoughts. Again, if you want to make comments, constructive comments or questions, go ahead, throw them in the comments section for this. That's what this is for. And let's see if we can work them out. Now, the first thing, I'm going to move on to the album now. The first thing that I want to mention is that the title of the album is something that is quite dubious. And, of course, the definition of meddle is to interfere in something that is not one's concern or not your business. So someone is interfering with something that doesn't have anything to do with them. What an ironic title, isn't it? I mean, why else would you name it Meddle? None of these songs seem to be about meddling, do they? Well, you can go through them on your own. I've looked through some of the lyrics already, so I have some talking points, but I don't see anything in here about meddling, so why is it called Meddle? Is that just because it kind of rhymes with or sounds similar to metal, M-E-T-A-L? That's up to you, I guess. You'll have to decide. But for me, I'm going to take it literally as the definition is, that someone is interfering with something else, or perhaps participating or something else. I don't know. But let's go ahead then and break down the very, very first song, which is called Pillow of Winds. And most of these songs are, well, I'm going to go through one at a time. So first off, my thoughts on One of These Days. Largely instrumental. There's only one line, which is something about, I'm going to cut you into little pieces, which is very strange. And I don't totally get what the point of that is, other than it kind of sets you on edge. And it does remind me of the Put Down That Axe, Eugene, or whatever Axe song that Mr. Roger Waters kind of, I believe, was credited with. Now, all four of the band members are credited with writing One of These Days, so take that as you will. The next song is Pillow of Winds, and I want to Syd score Pillow of Winds. So if you can on your phone or whatever else, let's pull up the lyrics, and we're going to see if we can trace any influences of Syd Barrett and his writing history in the song Pillow of Winds. The first is that, okay, we have mention of pillows and winds. I would give a point for this, of course, but the pillow idea is in Julia Dream, previously, Sunlight Upon My Pillow. And the winds is vague enough that, of course, winds are constantly being referenced by so many people that I won't give points for that. I will give a point for the very first line that mentions a cloud of eiderdown. Actually, I'm going to give two. One for cloud and one for eiderdown, because Mr. Barrett has specifically called out clouds and eiderdowns. Eiderdown was in, it's either Matilda Mother or Flaming. I think it's in Flaming. I'll put it on the screen. Anyway, a cloud draws around me. So drawing, I won't give a point for that because Mr. Waters also, now this was supposedly written by Waters and Gilmore, and I believe Mr. Waters was an architecture student, so he also was drawing, although not painting. Now the next bit is softening a sound, sleepy time. There's alliteration that's pretty strong on the S. I'll give a point for that. There's mention now sleepy time in lie, so I'm going to give another point for that. And a mention of sleeping by with love by their side, and that she's breathing low. And a candle dies. What that means, I don't entirely know, but we have references to sleeping there, etc. There's mention of night coming and locking the door and a book falling to the floor. A little bit creepy there. I'm going to give a point for that. It does kind of make me think of some of the fearful, slightly creepy songs that Mr. Barrett has written. It also reminds me of Julia Dream and the idea of hiding. But there's mention of waves rolling by and seasons changing. I don't know why the wind would be wry. There's mention of now wakes the owl and sleeps the swan. There may be very, very specific, very specific symbols tied within these. I know the swan is a very important symbol, but I don't know that I have information about it. Let me check really quick, see if I have information on the swan. Yes, so the swan, now I'm looking through J.E. Cirlot's thing here, and I have not looked through this before, so I'm just looking at it now. I just know that the swan is a complicated symbol. I thought it might have something in here, and it does. So let's see, I have some things underlined from some previous reading here. So the swan is the god of music, or is a representation of Apollo, the god of music, that it would sing sweetly at the point of death. Interesting. So the owl is awake, but the swan is sleeping. Why would the swan be sleeping? Because it is no longer making music. I'm going to give a point for that because at this point, Mr. Barrett was apparently no longer making music with the band. So that could be a reference to the swan sleeping. The next, and that is verified in the next two lines. The dream is gone. So the dream, perhaps, of being this great singer or leading a band is gone. Interesting. Okay. A white swan was, I guess that's enough. I'm not going to go into the swan too much. I'll just mention that the swan harp relationship corresponds to the axis of water fire. It denotes melancholy and passion, self-sacrifice, and the way of tragic art and martyrdom. Those are all very, very tightly bound up in the history of Mr. Barrett. I can see why perhaps that would be an influence, or perhaps if you think this is written by Mr. Barrett, you can justify it in that way. Now the next bit says that green fields are calling, and it's falling in a golden door. Okay. Well, green fields are fertile fields, and if someone perhaps had let a dream go to be with fertile fields, we have, if you go back and check out Peeling Syd Barrett, and one of the possibilities, of course, is the possibility of being with a certain someone, and perhaps even participating in a family that would justify or perhaps state the reason why green fields would be calling. So I'll give a point for that. The golden door is a fairly obvious symbol that I'm not going to get in too much. There's two ways of understanding golden door. One is quite vulgar and the other one is complex and quite beautiful. The beautiful aspect one would be, of course, that the golden door would be a reference to the door of birth, which corresponds with fertile fields. And deep beneath the ground, and the early morning sounds. Okay. And mention a sleepy time, lie, love by my side, breathing low. First rays touch the sky, and the night wings die. Okay, so that last line I'm going to give 2 points for. One is because it's a reference to sleeping and having dreams, and the other one is, of course, that dreams again have gone. So I'm going to give this first song, Pillow of Winds, a score of 10. I did not expect to find that many correlations that were that deep, so I'm a little surprised. Just my own personal thing there. So let's go to the next song here, which is called Fearless, and let's see if we can trace any Syd Barrett, perhaps influences, or perhaps any writing tendencies that may mirror Mr. Barrett. And this is a very simple song, and when I was young, this was one of my very, very favorite songs by Pink Floyd. I'll just kind of throw that out there. Okay, it starts off with someone saying that you have said that a hill is too steep to climb, and you're chiding, and you'd like to see me try climbing. Okay, so this idea of climbing a hill has been brought up before. I'm going to just give 1 point for this. And by the way, a Misty Riders Climbing was in Matilda Mother, and of course this idea of kind of climbing is also in the lyrics for Cymbeline, which is that the path is narrow and the drop is sheer and high, which is an indication that someone is treading a path that is very high up on a mountain, etc. And of course, we've gone through the tarot and the indications of the moon card and shown the path that leads to a mountain. The mountain is, of course, the mountain of our dreams, our goals, a higher self, spiritual realization, and perhaps people saying that it can't be reached, etc. Okay, so the next portion says you pick a place, and then I'll choose a time, and then I'll climb in my own way. And that's one of the most beautiful sentiments that I can consider, is that a person is saying that I'm going to try and do the best I can in my own way to reach where I'm trying to go to. Can I identify that as a Barrett specific writing? No, I can't. So I won't give any points. I just want to point out that that's very simply stated, and it's quite beautiful. There's a mention that you should wait a while for the right day. Rising above tree line in the clouds. There's another mention of clouds, so I'll give a point for that. Rising above the clouds. And then they look down and they're hearing. So you have cloud, down, sound, kind of an alliteration on the owl sound, so I'll give 1 more point. I'm at 3 points now. There's a mention of the next verse there is fearlessly an idiot facing a crowd, smiling, and a magistrate turning around frowning. And I have often wondered what the heck this could possibly be about. But who is sometimes judged to be an idiot, and who is sometimes judged to be a magistrate? This certainly could be a reference to the relationship between Mr. Waters and Mr. Barrett, in which perhaps Mr. Barrett is fearless, as the song the song is kind of relaying, is the idea of being fearless and trying to attempt something great. So the idiot is fearless, but the magistrate is merciless and frowning. Now, of course, the magistrate may not be Waters. Maybe, I don't know, an owner or a music magnate. I have no idea. But it's kind of funny. I've never read it that way before. I'll give it 1 point for that, because it seems to be a little bit of a joke, and perhaps that could be an indicator of Mr. Barrett, because he was into making these really, really wry, complex jokes. There's a mention in the next line about being a fool that wears a crown. There's a crown reference, a royalty, so I will give that a point. So we're at 5. Apparently go down in your own way, and every day, and do that every day, because every day is the right day. And then rising above fear lines in the brow. I'm not sure that these lyrics are totally accurate. I don't have a lyric book for this, so I'm just pulling them up off of somewhere. But I guess that's about it. That's all I'm going to end up with. I'm just going to end up with a score of 5 on Fearless, which is a little bit disappointing. I wanted more because I really love this song, but it's a relatively short song, so I guess that's understandable. But I can't really trace a whole lot of connections to Mr. Barrett in here, other than the general feel of it is very kind of dreamy and slow. But, you know, a lot of people can write like that, so I guess that's about it. Let's move on to the next song, which is San Tropez, which is attributed to Mr. Waters. Okay, so San Tropez, why San Tropez? I don't know. Mention that you reach for a peach and then slide a line behind. So reach and peach and the line behind, I guess. It's very simple, and we've seen Mr. Waters write very simple rhymes like this, so I'm not going to touch that. There's a sofa in San Tropez. There's a breaking a stick, breaking the sand, and then riding a wave in the wake of an old sedan. I see nothing in there that reminds me of Mr. Barrett, frankly. A mention of sleeping alone in the drone of darkness. I'll give 1 point for that, for the loneliness and the sleep. I guess I'll give 2 points for loneliness and sleep. A mention of being deep in dreams and still hearing someone call. And I mentioned that if you're alone, I'll come home, which is kind of suspicious, very similar to the idea in Julia Dream, and of course, in the song that Mr. Barrett wrote about looking at someone's hands and they're not like me. In other words, insinuating, of course, that there may be someone else at the home or they may have a relation. So I'm going to give 3 points now. Someone is backward and homebound. Why would they be traveling backwards and going back home? That reminds me of Mr. Barrett, so I'm going to give that a point. He's the one that kind of took a step backward and appeared to want to go back home to England during the American tour. A pigeon and a dove. Again, a pigeon is a pigeon, but a dove is a very, very complex symbol. So I'm going to see if there's anything in my book about doves. Just real quick, sorry, this will just take me a minute. I suspect that there will be something, and not least of which because this is a Christian symbol. So dove, okay, and there is a bit about doves. So there's a mention that the Slavs believe that at death the soul turns into a dove. It partakes in the general symbolism of flying, which is easily understood to be a spiritual movement. It is inspired in the scriptures. It depicts the third person of the Trinity or the Holy Ghost in the shape of a dove, and is also represented by the image of a tongue of Pentecostal fire. Again, from J.E. Cirlot. So, backward and homebound. A pigeon, of course, can find its way back home, and a dove would be kind of motivated by spirit. I don't know. It's a kind of a Christian reference, so I'll give it a point for that, because we've noted the many Christian references that Mr. Barrett makes. That one's kind of sketchy, but I'll go with it. Okay, there's a mention that they're gone with the wind, rain on an airplane, and born in a home without a silver spoon. I will give a point for that, and we haven't really discussed this before, but the silver spoon, being born in a home without a silver spoon, of course, Mr. Barrett and Mr. Waters' fathers died relatively young. I don't know that they had insurance back in those days for those types of things, but of course the man was the main breadwinner, and this is before a lot of women were working. I don't know that Roger Waters' mom or that Syd Barrett's moms were working. They may have been hurting for money for quite some time. The fear of that lack of a breadwinner in the household would have, of course, helped to explain a painting like The Boy and the Lion. I believe that was our episode 4 in Peeling Syd Barrett. And I'm certain that there's a lot of uncertainty in both of those households, or there was for a while, even though people may have thought they were doing relatively well because both of their families were in kind of well-to-do areas. So perhaps either one of them could have written about the idea of being born into a home without a silver spoon. So I'm going to leave that alone. There is mention, though, that now they're drinking champagne like a tycoon, and then gathering taking a break in the weather, waiting for that, and then gathering far-flung thoughts. Well, who has far-flung thoughts that need to be gathered? That sounds like Mr. Barrett to me. I don't know. I mean, maybe Mr. Waters has far-flung thoughts as well, but I do know that Mr. Barrett seemed to have quite a wide range of thoughts, and people quite often mention that his method of speaking could be quite obtuse, and he seemed to be struggling to pull thoughts together, so that seems to be something that could possibly be at least influenced by Mr. Barrett. There's another mention of wind and being alone, I'll come home. I won't give another point each time they mention that if you're alone, I'll come home. There's a mention that they pause for a while by a country style, listen to things people say. Okay, that actually sounds like a line that's something... That sounds almost like a line from a song by Led Zeppelin, personally. Okay, the last bit is digging for gold. Digging for gold, a hole in my hand. I don't totally get that. I that seems to be kind of a consideration of money. I don't know if it's good or I don't know if that's negative or positive. It sounds negative, which would be a Barrett tendency, but I'm not sure, so I'm just gonna leave it. The next bit is about opening a book and then taking a look at the way things stand. I'll give a point for that because Mr. Barrett, as we had mentioned, is very well read, and Mr. Waters himself in that interview that we just discussed mentions Mr. Barrett constantly pulling things from books and using them. Leading to a place by the sea. Again, making a date later by phone, and then if you're alone, I'll come home. And a mention of a soft voice. So that's pretty much it. For San Tropez, I have a score of 8. These are all kind of low scores, honestly. Pillow of Winds I have at 10, which is a pretty much average for us. So 5 and 8 are below average for Syd scores. So, of course, those are songs that you could argue don't seem to be overly influenced by Mr. Barrett. So the last song that I want to run through is Echoes, and this song is kind of the song. The entirety of the song, the sound of the song, kind of makes the album. It defines quite a bit of, I think, what they were trying to accomplish as a band for a long time. These kind of long, winding musicals that have ebbs and flows and merry lyrics that fit the sound of the band very well. So if you would pull up the lyrics to Echoes by Pink Floyd, and let's mess with this. And this is going to be a hard one because it's really it's kind of a complex song, but it's also in many ways a brilliant song. So the very first verse is absolutely astonishing, and as I break it down every time, I am blown away by the genius of these lyrics. Now, if you remember, Mr. Waters specifically points to the lyrics of this, and he mentions the third verse, which has to do with strangers passing in the street and separate glances meet. Okay, I want you to compare that with this very first verse, all right? This very, very first verse. And I guess what I want to get across is the word choice of this first verse is genius. It's absolute genius. So let's look at it, okay? First, the rhythm of it. So overhead, it has 3 syllables, and then 1. So 3, 1, albatross hangs. So that's again 3, 1, and then motionless, 1, 2, 3, and then upon, but just up, and then you go on the air. So it's a 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1, 3, 1 kind of a song, and the syllable arrangement is excellent. The rhythm, the excellent feel of the rhythm is beautiful. Now, I also want to point out that the combinations of words fit together extremely well. So first, I'm going to give a point just for the rhythm of it, because it's absolutely genius. The next thing I'm going to give a point for, which is interesting, is that albatross, overhead, albatross, motionless are using a lot of the same sounds. So albatross, motionless are married together. They feel like perfect descriptors of one another, and phonetically they match a lot. The S ending, the L's combined, and they really are beautiful. And of course, the imagery tied to the idea of an albatross hanging motionless is perfect. So I'm going to give that another point. I probably should give that 2 points. I might even give it 3 points, and I'll explain why later. I'm going to just give it 2 points, though. And the reason I say that I should give it 1 more point is because the albatross, of course, reminds me of the poem by Charles Baudelaire called The Albatross. And we'll get back to that here in a bit. I'm going to pull apart 2 things that are kind of tied to a couple of these songs, and I want you to kind of consider that they may have been influences on songs. So just remember here that this albatross is potentially a reference to a poem by Charles Baudelaire called L'Albatros. Okay, so the next line is that deep beneath rolling waves, labyrinths, and coral caves. All right, so again, the rhythm is excellent. It matches the first line of this verse. So one, 2, 3. So, and deep beneath the rolling waves in labyrinths of coral caves. It is 1, 1, 2, 3, 1, 1, 2, 3. Each time it's beautiful and it matches. I'm going to give another point for that. Now, let's look for words that match together. Of course, waves and caves match, but let's consider the idea that rolling waves and labyrinths and coral caves are using a lot of the same phonetic sounds, of course. The V, the B, the V of caves and waves, the B of labyrinths, the coral with an L, labyrinth and rolling. I'm going to give that 2 points because of the 2 forms of alliteration that tie in on all 3 of those pairs of words. They're wonderful. It's absolutely beautiful. Now, the next line is about an echo and distant time that's willowing across the sand. Another beautiful line, of course, because willowing is not a word. That is an adjective that is tied to the idea of willow, which is tied to sadness, which we've seen in previous Barrett songs, like See Emily Play. So I'm going to give that 2 points. So I'm currently at 8 points. There also is a mention of echo. An echo, of course, is almost like a wave, which could justify why this is happening in an ocean, because the waves themselves are echoes, which is wonderful imagery. So I'll give that another point. And the idea that these echoes of times, or these memories of times, are willowing across sand is quite an obvious relation to the idea of memories causing sadness, which is going to be another point, sadness and loneliness. I mentioned that everything is green, and then submarine. Okay, I'll give that another point for the green reference because it's another color reference. And submarine, which is a noun that's being used as a verb, or an adjective, sorry. So it's a noun that's being used as an adjective, that everything is submarine. In other words, everything is underneath the water, or distant, or dreamy. Hard to say what is meant by submarine, but that feel has a lot to it that ties in with the Syd Barrett song Terrapin, where we're discussing the idea of fishes, luminous whirl, fishes under the water, etc. This seems to be relaying the same idea of being underwater. What that means, hard to say, but it is consistent with the imagery that's relayed by Mr. Barrett. I am currently at 11 points, and we have just done the very first verse. Whew, so you can tell this one's going to be big, right? This is going to be kind of wild. There's mention that no one has showed us to the land, and no one has really shown us the way to land, or how to be on firm ground. The idea of being on firm ground is, of course, related in other Syd Barrett songs. The idea of being in quicksand or standing, I can't remember exactly what the words were, but perhaps I'll show that here. And no one knows where or why, as in where we are or why we're here. Something stirs, something tries, and then climbs toward the light. Now again, that feels very similar to the song Terrapin, where they're down deep, and then of course the light's very good for us, is a line that's in Terrapin. So let's keep going. Now here we get to the third verse, which is the verse that Mr. Waters calls out as being kind of his development. And I just want to point out that the absolutely astonishing beauty of the first verse, if I wrote this song, I would point everyone to that first verse and I would say, there is an example of my genius. But that hasn't happened. Mr. Waters is pointing us to this third verse, that strangers are passing in the street, and 2 separate glances meet, and then these 2 people seem to become one. In other words, I'm you, and I see me. And then they kind of take each other by the hand and go through the land and try to understand things best they can. So there's a repetitive and sound: hand, land, understand, can. It's very, very simple. It feels like something that Roger Waters could have written, and if you compare it with the first verse, I cannot explain. I can't explain how there's so much difference between those two verses, and how someone would write this and think it's genius, but miss on the first verse being total genius. Unless, of course, they're written by different people. It's a possibility. Were these written by different people? I don't know. You decide. At any rate, I guess I could give a point for the kind of clanging on the and sound, but it's so simple that I'm not going to give a point for it. Because, as I have mentioned before, that's kind of something that Mr. Waters seems to have a tendency to do. Although the flow of the meaning of this song seems to be consistent, I don't know. There's the next bit says that there's no one calling us to move on. No one forces their eyes down. No one speaks and no one tries and no one flies around the sun. Mention of the sun, I'll give a point for that. And why they would force down their eyes, I don't know. There are mentions in on the More album of the idea of being blinded or white light, etc. But again, that's on the More album. That's not attributed to Mr. Barrett, so I won't give a point for that. If you believe that Mr. Barrett had input into Cirrus Minor and Cymbeline and other songs on the More album, I guess you could give a point here, but I can't prove that, so I won't. I'm not going to. Okay, mention that cloudless, every day you fall upon their waking eyes. And so obviously the reference here is to the sun, that this is a sun reference, that the sun is falling upon their waking eyes and inviting them to rise through the window in the wall. Now there are so many references to windows by Mr. Barrett that I will give that one more point. So I'm currently at 14 points. And they come in on sunlight wings, bright ambassadors of morning. Million bright ambassadors of morning. It's an interesting combination of words, but I wouldn't say that it's genius. I mentioned in the next line that no one sings me lullabies. Well, who would sing someone lullabies, of course? Quite often that's their mom. That could be a mother reference. Another point is 15 for possible Syd Barrett references. No one is making them close their eyes, so they open the windows wide and call to someone across the sky. Who would they be calling to across the sky? I don't know. The song seems to have changed from this general idea of, before I thought this song was stitched together very well, but now I'm thinking that it's not. There's a mention of nobody showing them around. This albatross that's kind of hangingless and then flying through the air. And then there are strangers that are meeting. And some kind of relation between these two people. And then the person is alone again. And mentioning that, again, that sounds kind of like the idea perhaps that Mr. Barrett's alone. It seems to be someone that's kind of on a spiritual journey that perhaps thought that they were with someone, but now they're on their own again. So it's a little bit confusing in that way. At any rate, I end up with a total score, a Syd score of 15 on this song, which is kind of high, actually. And I do think it could even be higher if I wanted to kind of use my own opinion to justify that. It wouldn't be hard to justify it being higher than that, but I'm going to give it a Syd score of 15. Now, there are two things that, of course, I mentioned that I want to discuss. Let's do the Charles Baudelaire one real fast. So, I have previously discussed this very same poem by Charles Baudelaire entitled L'Albatros. Now, there are various translations of it, but I will just use, I suppose, I guess I will just use the George Dillon version. Okay, so I'll use the George Dillon translation. The third and fourth verse The albatross, of course, is this great animal that's flying on the air. It's effortlessly flying, of course, which could be a representation of artistic endeavor or spiritual endeavor, etc. And this albatross has landed on the ground, and of course, it is quite an apt representation of poets and spiritual people because they're trying to fly high in the sky, but when they're on the ground, they look incredibly clumsy and they're out of their element because their element is the wind. So the third and fourth verse really are the important ones, and I'll use George Dillon's translation here. He mentions that how droll is the poor floundering creature, how limp and weak. He but a moment passed so lordly, flying in state. There's a reference there to the idea of this kingly creature. They tease him. One of them tries to stick a pipe in his beak. Another mimics his laughter, his odd lurching gait. So they're making fun of the albatross now. The poet is like that wild inheritor of the cloud, a rider of storms above the range of arrows and slings. Exiled on earth, at bay amid the jeering crowd, he cannot walk for his unmanageable wings. Now, translations are always kind of clumsy, in my opinion. So it's kind of hard to really say, yeah, this is a good one or this one isn't. Usually there are certain things in translations that make them appealing, and there are other areas that I kind of don't like. But that gives kind of the general feel, and you have to kind of wonder who would be calling this out. Of course, I just want to point out again now, Jim Morrison also did a song called Riders on a Storm, and here's the idea of a creature that's riding on a storm, flying high above the storm. The last poem that I would like to kind of call out is from James Joyce chamber music, and of course we know that Mr. Barrett was interested in James Joyce chamber music because he wrote that song Golden Hair. Lean out your window, golden hair. So this is from James Joyce's chamber music, and it's the 35th verse, or the 35th poem in there, and I'll just read it to you. All day I hear the noise of waters making moan. Sad as the seabird is when going forth alone, he hears the winds cry to the waters monotone. The gray winds, the cold winds are blowing where I go. I hear the noise of many waters far below. All day, all night, I hear them flowing to and fro. That's it. It's a brutally beautiful and succinct poem written by James Joyce. It captures many of the ideas, I think, that are tied perhaps to this Echoes song, and perhaps explains, along with the albatross, the idea that it is possible that someone is tying together all of these references into a single song lyrically, which, as we have mentioned, and as Waters himself has mentioned, is a tendency of Mr. Barrett. So I do have to wonder if something like that isn't happening here with a song like Echoes. And of course, we broke down some of the content of the lyrics, and also it does kind of make sense and does seem to fit with perhaps influences of Mr. Barrett's life. I will also point out that in that James Joyce verse 35, he specifically mentions that the gray winds and cold winds are blowing where I go. We just did a breakdown of Syd Barrett, and he mentions going to the beach and Gigolo Aunt, and he says to see the blues and the grays. So perhaps that's what he means by grays. The winds, the gray, the cold winds, the gray cold winds of the beach. Perhaps that's what he means. At any rate, that's pretty much it. That's it for this episode. I hope you liked it. If you want to make comments, please feel free to do so. I mean, so long as they're constructive, and we can discuss things further. But hopefully you enjoyed this episode and it at least gave you some things to think about. I'll talk to you later.